Long before machines took over the dangerous, the dirty, and the dreadful, there were people who did those things by hand, because someone had to. They lived in the margins of history, men and women whose daily work flirted with death, superstition, and shame. They were the invisible gears of civilization, forgotten now, but essential then. These are their stories.
Chapter 1. The Gravediggers and the Sin-Eaters. When plague swept through medieval Europe, death came not in whispers but in waves. Gravediggers, or sextons in church records, became grim heroes of necessity. Armed with shovels and linen masks, they ventured into the streets where bodies lay stacked like firewood. For a handful of copper coins, they hauled corpses to mass pits, praying that the stench would not cling to them when they slept. Many didn't live long enough to spend their wages. But in the darker corners of Britain and Wales, another profession grew out of fear: the sin-eater. In an age obsessed with the salvation of the soul, some believed that the dead could pass their sins on to another through a ritual meal. A crust of bread, a cup of ale, and a whispered prayer over the corpse. The sin-eater would consume it all, symbolically devouring the sins of the departed, then be driven from the house, unclean and unwanted. They lived lonely lives, shunned even as they performed a sacred duty. To many, they were cursed. To the desperate, there were a final hope. Chapter 2. The Leech Collector. Medicine, before microscopes and modern science, was a practice of trial, error, and faith. In the 18th century, and even earlier, bloodletting was believed to balance the body's humors. Doctors needed a steady supply of leeches to draw that blood, and so the leech collector became an essential but nightmarish trade. They waded barefoot into bogs and marshes, allowing hundreds of slimy worms to attach themselves to their legs. The leeches drank until they swelled like grapes, and only then were they plucked off, bottled, and sold to apothecaries. The collectors were left weak, their legs riddled with sores. Yet they returned again and again, because each pint of blood they lost bought another day's bread. Imagine the sight: a woman standing knee-deep in the misty waters of a dawned swamp, her dress soaked, her skin crawling with living tools of medicine. History remembers the doctors. It forgets her. Chapter 3. The Gong Farmer. As cities grew in medieval England, so did their filth. Toilets, called privies, emptied into deep pits beneath houses. But once those pits filled, someone had to clear them. Enter the gong farmer, named for the Old English word gong, meaning excrement. By day they were invisible, by night indispensable. They crept through alleyways carrying buckets and shovels, lowering themselves into cesspits, sometimes 20 feet deep. For pennies, they hauled out the waste of entire neighborhoods, loading it into carts to be dumped beyond the city walls. The stench clung to them like a second skin. They were forbidden from entering taverns or churches. Even the wind changed direction for them. Yet without their foul labor, disease would have consumed the towns they served. The gong farmer was a human barrier between civilization and chaos, the one who cleaned what everyone else pretended did not exist. Chapter 4. The Dog Whipper. Step into a medieval church on a Sunday morning. The air smells of wax and incense. The priest begins his sermon, and then a scuffle, barking, chaos. Dogs, beloved companions and street scavengers alike, roamed freely through towns. To maintain order in the house of God, there was The dog whipper. Armed with a whip or a long rod tipped with brass, he patrolled the aisles, striking or chasing dogs that disrupted the service. Sometimes he carried a pouch of bread to lure them out peacefully. His office was officially recognized, his salary paid by the parish. Strange as it seems, he was part of a moral ecosystem, a symbol of order in a world forever teetering on the edge of wildness. The dog whipper kept chaos outside so the faithful could find peace within.
Chapter 5. The Whipping Boy. Among the royal courts of Europe, power protected itself in peculiar ways. Kings were sacred, princes untouchable. If a young heir misbehaved, no tutor or servant dared raise a hand against him, for striking royal blood was treason. So the crown devised a proxy, the whipping boy. Chosen from noble but lesser families, this child was raised alongside the prince, sharing his lessons and games. But when the prince erred, it was the whipping boy who was punished, flogged in his friend's place, while the guilty royal was forced to watch. The logic was twisted, but effective. By witnessing another suffer for his faults, the prince was meant to feel moral shame. Some grew close, friendships bound by pain and privilege. Others became bitter reminders of a system where innocence bled for power. Imagine the silence in a candlelit chamber, a tutor's voice, a lash, a child's cry, and a future king learning that power means never having to feel pain directly. Chapter 6. The Resurrectionist. Grave Robbers for Science. In 18th century Britain, curiosity was deadly. Medicine was advancing, yet the demand for cadavers outstripped the supply. Universities and doctors needed bodies for anatomy lessons, and the law permitted only executed criminals. But the supply was small. Enter the resurrectionist, the grave robber of the night. Under the cloak of darkness, they crept into churchyards and unmarked cemeteries. Shovels struck earth, coffins were pried open, and bodies were carried silently to waiting carts. Sometimes they worked in teams, sometimes alone. Fear was constant. Guards, watchmen, and the law itself threatened hanging or imprisonment. Yet the resurrectionists persisted, feeding the rise of modern medicine. The same hands that dug the graves also built the foundations of surgical knowledge. They lived in shadows, condemned by society, but immortalized by their contributions to science. Chapter 7. The Rat Catcher. While cities expanded, disease followed. Plagues, fevers, and filth bred vermin by the thousands. The rat catcher became a crucial figure in Europe's urban sprawl. Armed with ferrets, traps, and a steel-capped stick, he prowled streets, alleys, and attics. Some were mere trappers. Others were bounty hunters, collecting coins for each rat tail delivered to city authorities. The work was gruesome, dangerous, and odorous. Rats were carriers of disease, fighters, and sometimes lethal opponents. The rat catcher danced on the edge of life and death, and for a few shillings he kept cities from succumbing to plague. Imagine him in a London alley at dusk, moonlight glinting on his tools, eyes darting for movement, ready to strike, a man waging war against creatures most would flee from. Chapter 8. The Knocker-Up. Human Alarm Clock. Factories. The Industrial Revolution. The city that never slept, except its workers.
Before alarm clocks were cheap and reliable, someone had to ensure that laborers awoke on time. The knocker-up, sometimes armed with a long stick, sometimes with a soft tap on the window, became the human solution. They walked miles each night, tapping, shouting, or bouncing a heavy stick on shutters until every worker stirred. It was monotonous work, yes, but necessary. Without the knocker-up, the mills would halt, wages would be lost, and angry overseers would punish tardy laborers. They were the unsung heartbeat of industrial life, invisible, yet vital. Chapter 9. The Tanner. Leather making has existed for millennia, but during the industrial age, the tanner endured one of the foulest professions in history. Hides rotted in vats of urine, lime, and chemicals. The smell could overwhelm the senses. The work corroded the skin and lungs. Yet civilization demanded leather for boots, belts, saddles, and machinery. Tanners handled raw animal hides, scraped, stretched, and treated them until supple. Every shoe, harness, or glove in a European city bore the mark of their suffering. They were often social outcasts, their houses distant from clean towns, yet their labor made modern life possible.
Chapter 10. The Chimney Sweep and Child Labor. Few jobs were more dangerous than the chimney sweep. Young boys, some as young as 6, were forced into narrow flues to scrape soot from industrial chimneys. They were coated in black, their lungs choked with smoke and ash, their small bones sometimes fractured in tight passages. Parents often sold their children to masters, desperate for income. Death, disease, and deformity were constant companions. Yet these boys were essential. Without them, coal fires would fail, industry would stall, and urban homes would be smothered in smoke. It was work no adult dared attempt.
Chapter 11. Crossing Sweepers and Street Laborers. Across Victorian Europe, the streets were rivers of filth, mud, horse dung, and refuse. Crossing sweepers cleared paths for the wealthy, brushing muck aside to create a safe way through the city. The poor performed this labor for pennies, their hands and clothing forever stained. It was back-breaking, humiliating work, yet it provided a livelihood in a city that demanded obedience. The sweepers were invisible pillars of urban life, maintaining a fragile order in a chaotic environment. Chapter 12. The Darker Side of Industrial Jobs. The Industrial Revolution birthed not only progress, but horrors. Mines swallowed men whole, factories burned young apprentices alive, and toxic chemicals poisoned workers daily. These odd jobs, grotesque, hazardous, and demeaning, were necessary for the rise of modern society. The people who performed them were often nameless, yet their sacrifices powered the engines of history. They were the invisible workforce, whose courage and endurance remain etched in the bones of cities and the very infrastructure we take for granted. Chapter 13. Closing Reflection. From the leech collector wading through marshes to the chimney boy crawling through narrow flues, human history is filled with labor that most of us could never imagine enduring. Yet these odd jobs share a common truth. Civilizations are built not only by kings, scientists, and generals, but by those willing to face filth, danger, and scorn, to perform tasks so repulsive or perilous that no one else would. Their stories remind us that progress is often paid in sweat and blood, and that the extraordinary often lies hidden in the ordinary, disgusting, and forgotten corners of history.